be reading from Matthew 21 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. He said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and ending with the first." Then, when those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I chose to give the last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
I know nothing except what everyone knows. If there, when grace dances, I should dance. Words from the famous poet W.H. Auden. I know nothing except what everyone knows. If there, when grace dances, I should dance. Grace. That's an awfully churchy word these days. You don't hear much it outside of the church. And every time I say the word grace, I almost feel like it floats out of my mouth on an angel's feather. The word feels light and airy with little substance to it these days. What does that mean, grace? And yet I have the feeling grace is one of the most unsettling, disturbing, offensive realities at work in this world today. It's just that it feels so unfair. By its definition, grace is unfair. I want you to be home tonight at 11, the dad says as he wraps his arm around his teenage son. But Dad, I'm driving and I'm responsible. Can't I just stay out till midnight? I said 11. But Dad, Chad's parents let him stay out till midnight. Well, I'm not Chad's dad and this isn't Chad's house, my rules. And the boy swipes the keys and storms off and slams the door. That's not fair, he says. That's not fair. Sometimes I wonder if we have to learn that phrase, or if it's sort of in our tongue's DNA when we were born. It's just sort of built in there, some sort of primal speech. That's not fair. One of the first things children learn to say is, "That's not fair." A few years ago when we were living in Oklahoma City, I came home late one night just in time for dinner, fixed my plate, sat down at the dinner table. Rebecca had cooked pork chops, as I recall. I sat down and looked at my pork chop and Paxton's pork chop. He was 4 at the time, and Rebecca's pork chop. And I said, "Gosh, I got the smallest one." To which Paxton replied, "Dad, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit." And I said, "What? We didn't use that phrase in our home?" I said, "Where did you learn that?" And he said, "From Miss Kelly, my Mother's Day Out teacher." I said, "Oh yeah?" He said, "Yeah, whenever she gives prizes or hands out snacks, she says to us beforehand, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit." And I began thinking about it. If I was a teacher of 4-year-olds, that phrase would probably be in my arsenal as well. Can you imagine all the "that's not fairs" at snack time? I guess I should probably hold on to that phrase today too. It may come in handy for you somewhere along the way. You get what you get and you don't throw a fit. But I hope you'll excuse me if I'm slow to say that to the characters in our story today. I have some hesitancy about saying it to some of the characters in today's story. You see, there was this vineyard owner who needed people to work in his vineyard. In those days, agribusiness, there were times of the season in which you needed some extra help. And so this vineyard owner goes down to the unemployment office. It seems to be harvest time. He goes down at 6 a.m. and there's some workers there, and he says, "Hey, come work in my vineyard." They agree on a denarius. A denarius was a very fair wage for a day's work in that day. It was a generous wage, a just wage. It was a good day's work, salary for a good day's work. So at 6 a.m., these workers go, baskets in hand, picking grapes off the vine. At 9 a.m., the vineyard owner did the same thing, went to the unemployment office, got some workers, set them to work in his vineyard. At noon and at 3 p.m., the vineyard owner goes and does the same thing. Come work in my vineyard. And then the vineyard owner goes down to the unemployment office at 5 p.m. and he saw some people standing around. Now, what sort of folks do you think are standing around the unemployment office at 5 p.m.? These are the folks no one wants. These are the employees with no marketable qualities. Their resumes had some gaps in them. Their interview skills were lacking. Maybe English was their second language. Maybe they had a criminal record of some sort. Maybe they were too young. Or maybe they were too old. Or maybe they had a real job elsewhere and this was just for side income. I don't know. All we know is that the vineyard owner said to the 5 p.m.ers, "Come on and work in my vineyard." And so at 5 p.m., the leftovers set out in the vineyard to work. And though about an hour later, 6 p.m.-ish, the siren sounds, the horn sounds, and all the workers line up from the 6 a.m.ers to the 5 p.m.ers. It's time for pay. But when it came time to pay, the servant of the vineyard owner started at the back of the line. Did you hear that? The servant started with the 5 p.m.ers. And into each of their hands he placed a denarius. Now those who had been working through the longer part of the day were watching all this. They saw it and they began to elbow one another. If they got a denarius and they only worked 1 hour, what will we get? Can you imagine what we're going to get? They're almost giddy with excitement when the servant makes his way to them, and finally the servant makes it to the end of the line, and the 6 a.m.ers hold out their hand, and he says, "One for you, and one for you, and one for you." And they are sick of it. He paid them the same thing he paid those who worked only 1 hour. The 5 p.m.ers had barely broken a sweat, while these folks had been out there working all day in the hot afternoon sun, and all the 5 p.m.ers had barely filled their baskets. The 6 a.m.ers had filled up some wagon loads already. And the owner paid them the same thing. It is equal pay for unequal work, and it's just not fair. And those who had been there all day were offended. And I don't know how this story strikes you, but I think they've got a good point. Something deep within me says, had I been in the vineyard that day, I would have marched in their picket line, holding my sign saying, "That's not fair. That's not fair." I think they've got a point. But if we're honest with ourselves, we'd have to admit that sometimes our talk of what's fair and unfair is code language for what's good for us and what's bad for us, what's in our interests and what's not in our interests. One time in my life, I did something really stupid, just once. I got roped into officiating a peewee basketball game. Don't do that. Under no circumstances are you to say yes to that. It's bad for your health. It's bad for your faith. It's bad for your life expectancy. It's just bad. I'm refereeing a peewee basketball game. The instructions were These are pee-wee kids. They're learning the game. You could call travel and fouls on every possession, but just swallow your whistle. Nothing but blatant calls. Got it. Y'all, about halfway through the game, I had moms on both teams calling me a cheater, telling me to check my eyesight, and one mom I vividly remember had a vein protruding on this side of her neck as she yelled at me, saying that her 5th grade son, who was taller than I was and bigger than I was and had chest hair, was somehow being mistreated in the game. I'm running up and down the court, and moms on both teams are calling me a cheater. How is that possible? How can you cheat for both teams? And it hit me, sometimes what's fair depends upon what jersey you're wearing. Both political parties today talk about fair taxation. They both use the same words, fair taxation, but what's fair? Fair for whom? Might that depend upon which bracket you find yourself in? All too often, our talk of what is fair depends upon what jersey we're wearing. It depends upon how a given thing impacts us. It depends upon where we're standing. Upon closer examination, the problem in this parable is not that the owner is unfair. The problem is that he's too generous. When the 6 a.m.ers signed their contract that morning, the owner told them he would pay them a denarius, a good wage, a fair wage, a just wage, a generous wage. They got what they signed up for. At the end of the day, they received what they agreed upon. Had they been the only workers in the vineyard that day, something tells me they would have taken their denarius with a smile on their face, said, "Thank you, sir," stopped by the bar for a cold one on their way home, went home with their families, satisfied after a hard day's work and a good day's pay. Had they been the only ones there that day, the story would have ended right there. The vineyard owner had not shortchanged them in any way. And their problem isn't with their pay in and of itself. The problem is that he is just as generous with the bums who started at 5 p.m. He's too gracious to the latecomers. Auden said, "All I know is what everyone knows. If there when grace dances, I should dance." But when grace danced in the vineyard that day, the 6 o'clockers sat in the corner and said the music was way too loud. It's one thing, brothers and sisters, to sing, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." But it is a different world altogether to sing, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like you." It is not that the owners gave them too little, but that he gave the 5 p.m.ers too much. The problem here is with the comparisons, you see. Did you hear what the 6 o'clockers literally said to the owner? Did you hear what they really said? They said, "You have made them equal to us." That's what's offensive here. You've made them equal to us. You've treated them like us. This stomach-turning disdain is the kind of mindset that's so prevalent in our culture. Isn't this parable the spiritual equivalent of everyone gets a trophy? Which is what so many of us decry as the root of all evil in our day. Isn't this story, everyone gets a trophy? It's like when the teacher says, "Well, all my children are special." Isn't that another way of saying, no one's special? Or it's like when the teacher gives group work and you pull your weight. You're a good student. The other 4 in the group don't. They're lazy. And no matter whether you get an A or you get an F, the whole thing is not fair. It's like when the boss says everyone gets an equal raise. No one gets what they deserve in that case. The 6 o'clockers felt like their work had separated them from the rest, but the pay put them on the same level as the bums. And so they began to grumble. It's the word that's used over and over again of Israel when they're wandering out in the wilderness. They're always grumbling. It's the same kind of thing here. They're grumbling. When I was 14 years old, My dad, big baseball man, convinced me to try out for the American Legion baseball team in Forest City, my hometown. I was amongst the youngest to try out, scared to death, but absolutely determined to make the team for that reason. In practice, when we ran sprints in the outfield, all the other players would kind of cheat. I would run all the way, touch the foul line, had the chalk on my hands to prove it, just in case anyone asked. When the coach had us circle around and talk to us, I made eye contact, I nodded, I gave my nonverbal approval so that he would know that I was listening. After practice was over, I took ground balls, I stayed late, batting practice, all that. And the day came to see who made the team. And the coach rounded us all up and he said, well, boys, you all worked hard. You all improved. You all have talent. You all made the team. And I was sick. I had plans of going home and saying to my dad, I did it. I did it. I earned it. I beat out those older guys. I beat out those bigger guys. I did it. I walked home. Dad said, did you make the team? I said, yes, everybody made the team. If you were breathing, you made the team. Somehow, everyone being given the team did not mean as much to me as the idea that I somehow earned it. And that is one of the core convictions of our culture, brothers and sisters. Our work separates us one from the other. We get what we earn. We get what we deserve. A merit-based society. And then we come to the church and we say the word grace a lot. We say the word gift a lot. Grace means unmerited favor. Unmerited favor. In this way, grace is scandalous, it's subversive, and it doesn't compute in our minds. And it's why grace has offended me so many times. I'm a preacher. I peddle in grace. And it's scandalous. You ever heard of deathbed conversions? You know what I'm talking about? People who've lived their lives the way they want to, and yet on their deathbed, they come to Christ. They say a prayer, and poof, they're a Christian. Talk about showing up at 5 o'clock. Those folks don't have to mess with any church business. They don't have to sit through committee meetings. They never took a semester of Hebrew, for crying out loud, and they get the same grace I get. I hate that. Someone joins a church. I've been there all my life, blood, sweat, and tears in that place. And at the church business meeting, they can vote and I can vote, and their vote counts just as much as my vote. The newcomer can cancel out my vote. Sometimes I say to God, out in the real world, we reward people based on merits and just desserts. You're too nice to the losers of this world. And God says, my house, my rules. And I say to God, your kingdom doesn't make sense. And He says to me, well, you didn't think this was a meritocracy, did you? And I say to God, that's not fair. And He says to me, Preston, you get what you get, and you don't throw a fit. Brothers and sisters, God's grace is not just greater than all of our sin. God's grace is also greater than all of our righteousness. And if we never learn to make peace with that, we will never feel at home in God's vineyard. I think one of the people who best understood what life was like pre-civil rights movement is the Southern novelist Flannery O'Connor. In her short story, Revelation, a lady named Miss Turpin brings her husband Claude into the local doctor's office to get a wound treated. One of the hogs has kicked Claude and he's got a blister on his leg. They walk into the doctor's office and she's complaining about how the whole office, the waiting room is organized. You'd think a doctor that makes that much money could have a better waiting room than this. And while she's sitting there, she looks around the waiting room and notices all the other folks in there, and she begins to categorize them. There's some white trash in the room who don't treat their wild son who's bouncing off the walls. They don't treat him as well as they treat their pigs. And she all but lets them know it. There are some poor folks in the room, and she gives God praise that she's not poor. There's some sloppily dressed folks in the room, and she says it's one thing to be poor, and it's another thing to dress poor. She even says, I guess you have to have some things before you can know some things. She thanks God that she's not black. She's proud of who she is, just as she is. She's talking and commenting along the way, and there's a young girl in college with a short fuse there in the room. She's been looking over her novel the whole time, listening to all this, and finally this college girl gets up. She's tired of this insidious righteousness, and she calls Miss Turpin a warthog from hell and whacks her in the face with the book, knocks her out. The doctor sees both Miss Turpin and Claude, and towards the end of the day releases them so that they can go home. They go home to take care of the hogs, and at the end of the story, there's a scene I would like to share with you. The sun is going down, and Miss Turpin is at the hog pen. She has a vision, and I quote, "She saw the streak as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from the earth through a field of living fire. Upon it, a vast horde of souls were rumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first time in their lives, and bands of black folks in white robes, and battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. And bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself and Claude, had always had a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key. Yet, she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away." Did you hear that? She could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. Unquote. I hope you don't think I'm crazy, but I wonder if what she saw was the kingdom of God. I wonder if what she had a vision of that day was what life is really like in God's vineyard. If she saw some image of grace. Jesus' parable ends with two questions from the vineyard owner. Did you hear them? Don't I have a right to do what I want with my money? Or are you envious because I am generous? Y'all, grace is not fair. It's better than fair. For people who believe in competition and just desserts and merits and comparison, grace does not compute. It blurs the line between last and first so that you can't tell the difference between the two. It makes a mockery of coming in first. What does it mean to come in first when the race is grace? It burns away our vices and our virtues alike. You see, brothers and sisters, our comparatives will never be able to fully interpret God's superlatives. So long as we're looking at where we are in line and who's in front of us and who's behind us, so long as we're looking at our place in line, we're missing the God of the line. I have tried and tried, y'all, my whole life. I have tried and tried to think of someone I'm better than. And I cannot think of a soul. And if on that great day I am found to be in God's vineyard in some way, it will be because and only because God invited me, and somehow I said yes, and maybe that in and of itself is grace. If I am in God's vineyard, and I bet if you're in God's vineyard, it will be because grace called. And when grace calls, we can either cross our arms and pout, we can stick our fingers in the ear and say we don't like this kind of music, or we can dance. And I know nothing except what everyone knows. If there, when grace dances, I should dance. It's not fair. It's better. Oh God, we make sense of our lives by putting these people in this line and these people in this group and this group over here and that group over there, and we form our lines. And then you love us. Your grace falls down and covers us. But we look up and your grace has covered the whole stinking line. Oh Lord, when the day comes that we feel like we're in the vineyard because we deserved it, would you bring this story to mind? And when we chide you because your grace is too generous, would you remind us of all the times in church we stood and sang, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me," and actually mean it. Help us, O God, to share your grace even as we claim it. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.